Hey guys, today's story is something a little special. This one is from yours truly herself. Though it wouldn't be right to claim full credit, this is actually a story told to me by my uncle himself. He claims it to be 100% true, so take that as you will. Either way, it always freaked me out. Ever since I was a child, I've had an affinity for adventure. Nothing fills me with the same sense of overwhelming joy and adrenaline as running through the forest at dusk and exploring forgotten ruins of old buildings left to rot away. This same passion of mine has always filled my mother with great disapproval. Every time I would prepare to embark on a new journey, she'd give me the same old spiel about how foolish and dangerous such behaviors were, and how I really should listen when she told me not to go. Despite her warnings, I never ran into any trouble. Sure, I'd gotten my fair share of bumps and bruises from rough spills while hiking, but I wore them like battle scars. I knew the woods behind my house like the back of my own hand. So well, in fact, that I began to grow bored with them. However, to my delight, a few weeks ago, my mother informed me that we would be moving to a new town to be closer to my uncle. I won't list the name of said town because I don't trust you guys not to intentionally seek it out after what I'm about to tell you. But nevertheless, our new home is nestled in a rather large piece of property made up of several dozen acres in a heavily forested piece of mountain land. Anyways, it didn't take long for me to settle into our new place. Since my uncle now lived rather nearby, he was over helping us get unpacked. He brought my cousin with him, and it was only a matter of minutes before we discovered our shared love for adventure and began making plans to explore my new backyard. Seeing us leave, my mother once again stopped me at the door. Preparing for the worst, my cousin and I impatiently slumped our shoulders while she began her ever-so-familiar speech. However, this time she wasn't alone. My uncle had overheard her giving us the what for and decided to interject. "You really should mind your mama." "Oh great, not you too." I sighed loudly and turned my attention over to him, wearing a painfully skeptical expression. "I know that look," he said. "I gave it to my mama plenty of times in my day, but I'm being serious. The woods around these parts are not safe." My cousin and I exchanged wordless looks before reaching for the door once more. "Oh, you think I'm being funny, do ya?" His words were sharp this time. "I'll tell you what, I swore I'd never speak of this again, but if I tell you kids about something that happened to me years ago and you still want to go, I'll let you." By this point, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't interested in what my uncle had to say. I mean, my uncle is a 6'4" gun-toting mountain of a man. It would be an understatement to say that he don't spook easily. And whatever experience he had in those woods years back clearly had him shaken. "All right," we said in unison, backing away from the door and pulling out chairs from the kitchen table. He released a great sigh and closed his eyes before beginning to recall his tale. "Years ago, when I was about your age, my high school buddy lived on this property. We spent a good deal of our time out there exploring. This land goes through all sorts of terrain, you know. It's not easy to keep track of it all. Damn near impossible to even know if you're the only one living here. Well, my buddy and I heard rumors that back in the 60s, a group of hippies built a little commune out there somewhere, unbeknownst to the landowner. Being young and curious, we decided to go see for ourselves if there was any truth to the rumors. We searched for weeks. Even on our ATVs, there was only so much land we could cover if we wanted to be home before dark. Mind you, this is cougar country, so you gotta be home before dark. Anyway, one day after riding for what felt like hours toward the southwest border of the property, we finally found it. Eerie as hell, I'll tell you right now. It was clear that it had been vacated for several years by then. It was a perfect little ghost town. It consisted of about 12 to 15 little buildings and what appeared to be a giant old fire pit. The buildings were covered in moss and the windows were full of dust. Upon peeking in, it looked as though the buildings functioned like community lodges meant to house a decent number of people. The doors were nailed shut, and We didn't have a hammer on us, so we resolved to keep looking around and return another day with a hammer or crowbar at hand. After snooping around the ghost town for a while, we noticed a little shack a fair distance away. My friend told me that this was likely a honey shack, or otherwise known as the place where couples stayed when they wanted a little privacy from the rest of the community. Upon approaching the shack, we discovered that the door was not nailed shut like the others. We excitedly made our way inside, where we were surprised by the relatively good condition of the interior. Other than the dust and cobwebs, it looked great. It had shag carpets, cushy old furniture, and some ugly retro wallpaper. All in all, not bad. We even discussed turning it into a new hangout place for the rest of our friends back at school. It wasn't until we were heading back out that we noticed it. In the corner of the living room, plopped onto a little chair, was an enormous doll. It looked like one of those little wooden artist dolls, but it appeared to be plush, and it was life-size. It was sitting arched over, with its arms bent out and resting upon its knees. It almost looked like it was lost in thought, but its head pointed up, as if looking at us. If it hadn't been so goddamn eerie, we might have been curious as to how the heck it was articulated to sit that way. But there was no way in hell we were getting close enough to find out. Both my friend and I became incredibly uncomfortable. There wasn't anything logically frightening about it. It wasn't particularly scary looking. It didn't have a scary face sewn on or drawn on. No threatening messages scrawled out. No satanic symbols. Nothing. Just a blank face staring emptily at us. But still, something felt off. Very off. Enough so that just looking at the damn thing made my stomach toss. There was no apparent danger in it, yet it shook us both. We immediately left the shack, closing the door tightly behind us before hopping back on our ATVs and taking off straight for home. Didn't matter that there were still plenty of good sunlight hours left. We had both had enough exploring for that day. We both felt the same, yet neither one of us wanted to bring it up again. And so we just sort of let it lie and decided we didn't really need to hang out in that neck of the woods anymore. And let it lie we did. Years passed and we both eventually forgot about the commune and the creepy doll. As we got older, our desire to explore the woods sort of just fizzled out, and it was replaced by a desire to chase girls and get part-time jobs. Just normal growing up stuff. Despite this, we still stayed friends all the way through high school and even kept in contact through college. It wasn't until our junior year in college that we finally returned. My friend had invited a bunch of us out to his property for a big party. We were all pretty smashed, so by the time he brought up the subject of that old hippie commune, the thought to decline never occurred to me. I was amazed that he even remembered, and I'd be lying if I said my stomach didn't slightly lurch when the memory returned. But there was a pretty girl there I was trying to impress, so my machismo couldn't fail me now. So I simply shoved the sinking feeling to the back of my mind and grabbed another beer for an extra helping of liquid confidence. The memory's a bit hazy, but I remember that our group climbed into a couple souped-up trucks that made record time to the commune. Perks of being an adult with a license and a vehicle with 4x4. We got there and it was pretty much the same as when we had last been there. Old buildings slowly rotting away. We broke into a few of the larger buildings and snooped around. It was actually pretty fun. After a while, one of us remembered the old honey shack, and upon the mention of such a tantalizing place, the group clamored to go look. Again, that nasty feeling rose up, but I ignored it. I really wish I hadn't. Though the door was still tightly shut, just how we left it, the interior was not at all the same. It had been completely trashed. The wallpaper had been slashed to ribbons, the carpet was torn up in patches, and the stuffing from the furniture tossed about. We looked for signs of an animal entering, but that place was locked up tight. Among all the destruction, one single thing remained the same. that goddamn doll was still there, sitting slumped over in the chair in the corner of the room in the exact same position it had been in years previously. At this point, my memory really gets hazy. I mean, nothing but a blur. It's like I completely blacked out. And yes, I had been drinking earlier that evening, but by then, hours had passed and I was all but entirely sober. It's so strange. I remember leaving the shack, and then nothing. My uncle stopped speaking for a moment at this point. He squeezed his eyes shut and frowned. It took him a few moments before he began speaking again. The next thing I remember, I was coming to inside a building. It took me a moment to realize where I was and what it was I was doing. As my senses returned, I noticed that I was standing upright and swinging my arm. It took a second to register that I was holding a large rock in one hand and a handful of old, rusty nails in the other. The swinging of my arm had been from using the rock to drive the rusty nails into a door frame. And I knew this door frame. I was all alone in the old honey shack, sealing myself inside. Horror began to rise up inside of me. I frantically looked around, hoping it was some kind of twisted prank, but I was utterly alone, and night had fallen. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise as I slowly turned to face the direction of the small chair, but this time, the doll wasn't there. I began to hear a violent scratching sound from the direction of the kitchen. It was growing louder and heading in my direction. I frantically began pulling the nails out of the door frame, the scratching growing louder and louder, and I knew it had to be nearly right behind me, but I couldn't bring myself to look. With one last desperate tug, I pulled out the last nail to be able to open the door and threw myself out, slamming it behind me. I broke into a dead run towards my friend's house, screaming as loudly as I could. Fortunately, a group of people weren't too far off. They were carrying flashlights and apparently had returned to look for me. I tried to tell them what had happened, but I was in such hysterics that they couldn't even understand me. Upon returning to my friend's house, he demanded to know what had happened. Apparently, right after the group had started to leave the honey shack, I had gone berserk. I had started screaming at them that they needed to leave, and when my friend tried to grab me, I clocked him and continued shouting and demanding everyone leave. Not knowing what to do, and seeing me act so out of character, they decided to take the women back and return for me later, assuming I was drunk and needed the time to sober up. I never could bring myself to tell him what exactly happened. I just forced a chuckle and apologized for my drunken behavior and said it wouldn't happen again, but I think he knew something was off. Don't know why I couldn't bring myself to tell him, but at the time, I just couldn't. I simply warned him to never go back there. I realize I probably should have just told him. Not knowing the truth probably filled him with such a burning curiosity that he couldn't follow my advice. Or at least, I assume he didn't. Because not but a few months later, entirely out of the blue, the house was on the market. His folks never did give a reason, but they had a real squirrely vibe about them and dodged any further questions. They left as soon as they found a new place and never did look back. Now, I'm not trying to be a stick in the mud. I just really think you ought to mind your mama.